There are moments that carve themselves so deeply into your soul that they become the axis around which your entire existence turns. For me, it was when the church bell tower clock struck 12:15 on what should have been the happiest day of my life, and the crushing realization dawned that the man I'd promised to love forever had vanished like morning mist. But what I didn't know as I sat there in my mother's hand-sewn wedding gown with its 73 pearl buttons was that this shattering betrayal would become the foundation of a story far more extraordinary than any fairy tale I'd ever dared imagine. My name is Eleanor Rose Thompson, though the neighbors here in Millfield, Ohio, have called me Grandma Ellie for longer than I care to admit. At 82, I've lived long enough to understand that the most beautiful gardens often grow from the most barren soil, and the strongest hearts are forged in fires that would consume lesser spirits. The small wooden house where I'm sitting now, with its creaking floorboards and rose-patterned wallpaper, has witnessed more joy and sorrow than most cathedrals. It's where I raised my daughter Sarah, not born to me, but claimed by me in the fierce way mothers claim their young when love transcends blood. It's where I've served fresh-baked chocolate chip cookies to 3 generations of Millfield children, where I've listened to confessions that would make priests weep, and where I've learned that sometimes the life you never planned becomes the life you were always meant to live. But before I tell you about the woman I became, let me take you back to the girl I was on June 12, 1964, a day that began with such promise and ended with the kind of devastation that either destroys you completely or transforms you into someone you never knew you could be. The morning dawned with the kind of crystalline perfection that seems to exist only in memory. The Ohio sky stretched endless and blue above our little town, painted with wisps of clouds so delicate they looked like angel's breath. I was 21 years old, my heart brimming with dreams as sweet and golden as the sunlight streaming through my childhood bedroom window. Lord have mercy, Eleanor Rose! You're going to stop traffic in that dress! My mother whispered, her voice thick with emotion, as she fastened the final pearl button at the base of my neck. Her fingers trembled, whether from excitement or some deeper premonition I'll never know. The wedding dress was her masterpiece, created from ivory satin she'd saved for 3 years to afford. Every stitch was a prayer, every pearl button a small blessing. The bodice hugged my waist like a lover's embrace, and the skirt spread around me in waves of silk and promise. When she placed my grandmother's veil on my head, the same veil worn by Thompson brides, for 4 generations, I felt the weight of all their hopes settling on my shoulders like a benediction. Ah, Mama, I can barely breathe. I laughed, though, whether from the tight bodice or overwhelming joy I couldn't say. That's not the corset, sweetheart, she said, tears sliding down her cheeks. That's happiness, taking up all the space in your chest. Save some room for the rest of your life. My father appeared in the doorway, wearing his best suit and an expression I'd never seen before, pride mixed with something that looked almost like grief. Daddy wasn't a man given to displays of emotion. He showed love through steady work, quiet protection, and the way his eyes lit up when his girls entered a room. But that morning, watching his youngest daughter transform into a bride, something cracked open in his weathered face. "You look like an angel, Ellie," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Richard Miller is the luckiest man who ever drew breath." The ceremony was set for noon at First Baptist, where my parents had married, where I'd been baptized at age 8, where I'd sung in the children's choir and dreamed of walking down that aisle in white. Richard and I had been sweethearts since our junior year at Millfield High, that magical time when first love feels like destiny and forever seems as certain as sunrise. He was beautiful in the way small-town boys could be tall and lean, with dark hair that fell across his forehead, eyes the color of summer storms, and hands gentle enough to coax music from his guitar, or courage from a frightened girl's heart. When he returned from his 2 years of military service, bronzed and broader, but with the same crooked smile that had stolen my heart, his proposal felt like the natural culmination of our story. "Eleanor Watson," he'd said, dropping to one knee in Millfield Park, while fireflies danced around us like tiny stars, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife and making every day of my life feel like the 4th of July? The ring was modest, a small diamond that had belonged to his grandmother, but it caught the light like captured starfire. When I whispered yes through happy tears, the future unfurled before us like a road paved with golden intentions. By 11 o'clock that wedding morning, our little house buzzed with the joyful chaos of celebration. My sister Judy helped arrange the borrowed car that would carry me to church, while my 2 best friends, Margaret and Dorothy, fussed over their bridesmaids' bouquets, white roses, and baby's breath tied with powder blue ribbons to match their dresses. The whole town seemed caught up in our happiness. Mrs. Henderson from next door brought her famous 7-layer cake. The Miller boys delivered chairs for the reception that would spill across our backyard under the June sun. Children pressed their faces to windows, giggling at the sight of me in my finery. In a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, a wedding wasn't just a private celebration, it was a renewal of hope for the whole town. At 11:30, I stood before my bedroom mirror for one last look at the bride I'd dreamed of becoming. The woman staring back at me was radiant, her cheeks flushed with anticipation, her eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. I touched the small pearl pendant at my throat, Richard's wedding gift to me, and whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever forces had conspired to bring us to this perfect moment. "Time to go, sweetheart," Daddy called from downstairs. The drive to the church should have taken 7 minutes. I counted every one, my hands folded carefully in my lap to avoid crushing the bouquet of white roses and daisies, my favorite flowers, the ones Richard brought me every Friday evening during our courtship. The streets of Millfield passed by my window like scenes from a beloved movie, the barber shop where Richard got his hair cut, the soda fountain where we'd shared countless cherry cokes, the park where he'd asked me to marry him. "Nervous, baby girl?" Daddy asked, catching my eye in the rearview mirror. "Happy nervous," I replied. "Like Christmas morning and the first day of summer all rolled into one." But as we pulled up to the church, something felt wrong. The parking lot was full. Over 200 people had come to witness our union, but there was an undercurrent of tension I couldn't identify. Little clusters of guests stood on the church steps, their voices low, their expressions troubled. Mrs. Patterson, our neighbor, hurried over as soon as we parked. "Eleanor, honey, you look absolutely beautiful," she said, but her smile seemed forced. "Don't you worry about a thing. I'm sure everything's going to work out just fine." Don't worry about what I wanted to ask, but Daddy was already helping me from the car, careful not to let my dress touch the ground. The church bells began to chime 12 measured notes that should have been calling us to the altar, but instead felt ominous, like a countdown to something I didn't understand. Inside the church's small antechamber, my bridesmaids waited with expressions that made my stomach clench with sudden dread. Dorothy's eyes were red with unshed tears. Margaret kept twisting her bouquet until the stems threatened to snap. "Where's Richard?" I asked, surprised by how small my voice sounded. "I'm sure he's just running a little late," Judy said, but she couldn't meet my eyes. "You know how men are about punctuality." Through the small window that looked out onto the sanctuary, I could see the pews filled with friends and family, all turned toward the empty altar, where Reverend Wilson waited, with the patient expression of a man who had performed thousands of ceremonies and knew that life rarely went according to schedule. The organist played soft hymns to fill the growing silence, but I could hear the murmur of concerned voices beneath the music. 12:15 came and went, then 12:30. By 12:45, even the most optimistic among us could no longer deny that something was terribly wrong. Tommy's wife, Linda, appeared in the doorway, looking as if she'd seen a ghost. "He didn't come home last night?" she whispered to my mother. "After the bachelor party, he just disappeared. The bachelor party. Of course. They'd probably all had too much to drink at Murphy's Tavern, lost track of time, maybe got into some harmless trouble. These things happened. Richard would appear any minute with a sheepish grin and a story that would become family legend. But as 1 o'clock approached with no sign of my groom, the truth began to settle over the church like a suffocating blanket. Whispers grew into open conversations. Children grew restless in the heat. My beautiful bouquet began to wilt in my trembling hands. Reverend Wilson appeared in the antechamber, his kind face etched with concern. "Eleanor, dear child, perhaps we should consider postponing." "No!" The word tore from my throat with surprising force. "He's coming. He wouldn't do this to me, to us." But even as I spoke, I could feel the foundation of my certainty crumbling. Through the window, I watched Richard's mother collapse into her husband's arms, her sobs audible even through the thick walls. If she who had raised him, who knew him better than anyone, had given up hope. What did that say about the boy I thought I knew? At 1:15, my father entered the antechamber. His face, a mask of barely controlled fury mixed with heartbreak. "Ellie, honey," he said, his voice gentle despite the storm in his eyes. "I think it's time. Time." Such a simple word, but it carried the weight of the world. Time to admit that the future I'd planned was nothing but smoke and mirrors. Time to face 200 guests with the truth none of us wanted to acknowledge. Time to accept that the man I'd loved since I was 17 years old had chosen to humiliate me in the most public way possible. "I don't understand," I whispered, and for the first time all day, my carefully applied mascara began to run. "What did I do wrong?" "Nothing, sweetheart." Daddy pulled me into his arms, and I breathed in the familiar scent of his aftershave and the farm dirt that never quite washed from under his fingernails. "You did nothing wrong. This is not about you." But it felt like it was about me. It felt like every insecurity I'd ever harbored about not being pretty enough, smart enough, interesting enough, had been proven correct in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. If I had been worth staying, for Richard would be here. If our love had been real, nothing could have kept him away. Reverend Wilson made the announcement that would echo through Millfield for years to come. His voice carried to every corner of the sanctuary, reaching into every heart with the weight of shared disappointment. "Friends, it appears there will be no wedding today. We ask that you keep the Watson and Miller families in your prayers during this difficult time." The sounds that followed would haunt my nightmares for months, the scrape of chairs as guests rose, the rustle of programs being folded and tucked into purses, the low murmur of voices struggling to find appropriate words for an inappropriate situation. Some people offered awkward condolences as they filed past me, their faces twisted with the peculiar mix of sympathy and curiosity that disasters inspire. Others couldn't look at me at all, as if abandonment might be contagious. Mrs. Henderson squeezed my hand and whispered, "You hold your head high, Eleanor Watson. This is his shame, not yours." But her kindness only made the humiliation burn brighter. That evening, as I sat in my bedroom, still wearing my wedding dress, unable to bear the thought of removing it, and admitting the day was real, Sheriff Jenkins arrived at our front door. His news confirmed what we all suspected, but no one wanted to voice. Found Richard's Ford at the bus station in Columbus," he told my parents in the living room below my window. "Ticket agent remembers selling 2 tickets to New York City yesterday evening. Paid in cash." 2 tickets. Richard and Tommy, his best man and oldest friend, had planned this escape together. They hadn't been overcome by last-minute nerves or bachelor party hijinks. This had been deliberate, calculated. They had looked me in the eye at the rehearsal dinner, had toasted our future happiness, all while knowing they would be gone before the sun rose on our wedding day. I cried until my body had nothing left to give. great heaving sobs that shook the very foundations of who I thought I was. My mother sat beside me through the long night, stroking my hair and whispering the kinds of meaningless comfort that meant everything when you're drowning in grief. "Why, Mama?" I kept asking through my tears. "Why would he do this? What's wrong with me?" "Nothing is wrong with you, baby girl," she replied, her own voice thick with unshed tears. "Sometimes people make choices that have nothing to do with the people they hurt. Sometimes people are just broken." A week later, a letter arrived with a New York postmark. My hands shook so violently I could barely tear open the envelope. Richard's familiar handwriting, the same hand that had written me love letters during his military service, delivered the final blow to my shattered heart. "Eleanor," it read. "No dearest, or my love, or even dear. Just my name stark and cold as a headstone. By the time you read this, I'll be starting my new life. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused, but I couldn't go through with a marriage that would have trapped us both in that small town forever. I hope someday you'll understand that I did this for both of us. Richard." Not "Love, Richard." Not "I'll miss you." Not even a proper goodbye. Just a self-serving justification that justified nothing at all. I took that letter to the kitchen sink and struck a match, watching the flames consume his words, just as surely as his betrayal had consumed my faith in love itself. As the last corner curled into ash, I made a vow that would sustain me through the dark months ahead. This would not destroy me. Somehow, someway, I would survive this devastation and build something meaningful from the wreckage of my dreams. I just didn't know how. Not yet. The summer of 1964 passed in a haze of grief and gradual awakening. While other young women my age enjoyed beach picnics and drive-in movies, I remained largely hidden in my childhood bedroom, emerging only for meals and the occasional foray to the mailbox, always hoping for another letter that would explain what couldn't be explained. Millfield, with its population just shy of 3,000 souls, suddenly felt as confining as a cage. Every street corner held memories of Richard and me walking hand in hand. Every shop window reflected the ghost of our shared dreams. The soda fountain, where we'd spent countless Friday evenings, now seemed like a shrine to my foolishness. "Eleanor Rose Watson, you cannot hide from the world forever," my mother declared one sweltering August morning, marching into my room and throwing open the curtains with military precision. Sunlight flooded the space, making me squint like a startled nocturnal creature. "Mrs. Willis called from the elementary school. They need a secretary, and she specifically asked for you." I burrowed deeper under my quilt. "I'm not ready, Mama." "You'll never be ready if you wait to feel ready," she replied, with the kind of practical wisdom that had carried her through 30 years of marriage to my father. Sometimes you have to do the brave thing first, and the courage comes after. 3 days later, I found myself behind the reception desk at Millfield Elementary, pecking at a typewriter and answering phones with a cheerfulness so forced it fooled no one, least of all myself. Parents registering their children would double-take upon seeing me, their expressions shifting quickly from surprise to that awful pity I'd come to know so well. "Just look them straight in the eye," advised Mrs. Willis, the no-nonsense principal who had hired me despite my notorious status as the town's most famous jilted bride. People forget their own curiosity when they're met with dignity. Slowly, painfully, I began to establish a new routine. Rise at 6:30 breakfast with my parents, who pretended not to notice when I pushed food around my plate without eating. Work from 8 to 4, immersing myself in enrollment forms and lunch money collections. Home for dinner and long evenings with books while my mother knitted and my father read his newspaper. It wasn't living, not really, but it was existing, and some days existing was enough. That October autumn arrived with its usual fanfare of scarlet maples and golden oaks, painting Millfield in colors so brilliant they made my chest ache with their beauty. With the changing season came unexpected news. Tommy Patterson had returned from his New York adventure looking 20 pounds thinner and 10 years older than his 23 years warranted. "He's asking about you," my sister Judy informed me after church one Sunday. "Says he needs to talk to you about Richard." "I have nothing to say to either of them," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. But Tommy was persistent. He waited outside the school one gray November afternoon, leaning against the flagpole like a scarecrow in an expensive suit that had seen better days. His once handsome face was gaunt now, his eyes hollow with the kind of defeat that comes from chasing fool's gold and finding only dust. 5 minutes, Ellie," he pleaded when I tried to walk past him. "Please, I owe you that much." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at Henderson's Diner, the most public place I could think of. If he had come to deliver Richard's apologies or excuses, I wanted witnesses to my refusal to accept them. "He's not coming back," Tommy said without preamble, stirring his coffee endlessly without drinking it. "Richard, he's married now. Some society girl from a wealthy family. Her father pulled strings to get him into Columbia Law School." The news hit me like a physical blow, though I shouldn't have been surprised. Of course, Richard had landed on his feet. Men like him always did, cushioned by charm and opportunity, and the kind of ruthless ambition that let them step on other people's hearts without looking back. "Her family has connections all over New York." Tommy continued, his voice hollow. "They're setting him up with a position at her uncle's law firm when he graduates. He's doing well for himself." "And you?" I asked, surprised by my own curiosity. "Why did you come back?" Tommy's laugh was bitter as unsweetened chocolate. "Turns out I wasn't cut out for the big city Ellie. Or maybe the big city wasn't cut out for me. I ran out of money, couldn't find decent work. And Richard—" He paused, his jaw working like he was chewing something distasteful. "Let's just say his new life didn't have room for old friends from Ohio." I should have felt vindicated by Tommy's failure. Part of me wanted to gloat, to tell him this was what happened to people who helped break innocent hearts. But all I felt was tired. "Why are you telling me this, Tommy?" "Because I'm sorry." His voice cracked like a teenage boy's. "I'm sorry I helped him. I'm sorry for what we did to you. You deserved better than that." He paused, then delivered the final insult. "And because Richard wanted me to find out if you'd moved on yet, if you'd gotten over him." The audacity of it. Richard's casual curiosity about my recovery from his betrayal ignited something in me that had been dormant for months. Not love, not even hatred, but a fierce determination that blazed like a cleansing fire. I stood up from the booth, my back straight and my voice steady. "You tell Richard Miller that Eleanor Watson doesn't waste her time thinking about cowards who run away in the night. You tell him I wish him and his new wife every happiness they deserve." I walked out of that diner with my head held high, feeling something shift inside me like a bone snapping back into place. It wasn't healing, not yet. But it was the first step toward reclaiming the woman I'd been, before Richard Miller convinced me I wasn't worth staying for. The winter of 1964 was the coldest Ohio had seen in decades, as if nature itself was grieving alongside the human hearts struggling to stay warm in its grip. Pipes froze, solid schools closed for days at a time, and neighbors took turns checking on elderly residents as temperatures plummeted to depths that killed hope along with the flowers. In January, a devastating ice storm left much of Millfield without power for nearly a week. My parents and I took in our elderly neighbors, the Harrises, whose small frame house had become dangerously cold. Mr. Harris had a weak heart, and the stress of the storm triggered a severe attack that left him gray-faced and gasping on our living room sofa. With the telephone lines down and the roads impassable, I was the only one who could help. I bundled myself in every layer I owned and set out through the storm for Dr. Peterson's house 3 blocks away. What should have been a 10-minute walk became an hour-long battle against wind that cut through my clothes and ice that sent me sliding into snowdrifts. When I finally reached Dr. Peterson and brought him back to save Mr. Harris, the old physician looked at me with new respect. "You've got steel in your spine, Eleanor?" he said as he packed his medical bag. Ever consider nursing? The hospital in Athens is starting a training program this spring. I hadn't considered nursing, hadn't considered much of any future beyond my day-to-day existence. But something about the idea took root in the fertile ground of my slowly healing heart. Helping the Harrises had been the first time in months I'd felt something other than numbness or pain. For those crucial hours, I had been needed, useful, strong. When spring finally arrived, I enrolled in the nursing program, commuting 20 miles to Athens each day in my father's old Chevrolet. My parents were supportive, if surprised. No Thompson or Watson had ever pursued medicine before. "I'm proud of you, Ellie," my father said simply. Coming from him, a man who measured words like gold and spent them even more carefully, it meant everything. Nursing school proved more demanding than I had ever imagined. The human body, with its intricate systems and heartbreaking vulnerabilities, became my new obsession. There was no time for self-pity when learning to dress wounds, administer medications, or hold the hands of the dying while their families wept. For the first time since Richard left, I went entire days without thinking of him. By 1967, I had completed my training and secured a position at Athens Memorial Hospital in the maternity ward. The irony wasn't lost on me, the abandoned bride now helping to bring new life into the world. But there was healing in it too. Each tiny face, each new family formed in those sterile rooms, helped to mend something that had been broken inside me. I moved into a small apartment near the hospital, fiercely proud of my independence. My mother worried about me living alone. "A young woman needs protection," she'd say, but I found strength in solitude that I'd never known I possessed. The world outside Millfield was changing rapidly in those years. The evening news brought images of Vietnam, of protests and cultural revolutions that seemed to be happening in a different universe from my structured days of rounds and charts. Yet even our small corner of Ohio couldn't remain untouched by the tumult of the times. In late 1968, the hospital received its first casualties from Vietnam local boys shipped back with injuries too complex for military hospitals to handle. Their broken bodies and haunted eyes affected me deeply. I volunteered for extra shifts on the veterans ward, drawn to their suffering in a way I couldn't fully explain. "You're good with them," Dr. James Matthews commented one evening as I coaxed a young soldier barely older than I had been on my wedding day to eat his dinner. "They respond to you in ways they don't with the other nurses. I understand what it's like when the future you counted on just disappears," I replied, surprising myself with the honesty. James became my closest friend during those long nights on the ward. He was a decade older than me, divorced, dedicated to his work to the exclusion of almost everything else. We shared coffee during breaks, occasionally a meal after our shifts. He never pushed for more, and I appreciated his respect for the walls I'd built around my heart. "You ever think about what's next, Eleanor?" he asked one night as we watched a thunderstorm from the hospital cafeteria windows. "After the hurt fades, I considered his question seriously. "I think this is what's next, James. This work. These patients. That's all." I shrugged. "It's more than I thought I'd have 4 years ago." The spring of 1969 brought tragedy to Millfield that would change the course of my life in ways I could never have anticipated. A school bus carrying children home from a field trip crashed into Cooper's Creek during a flash flood, sending 23 children and their adult chaperones into the churning water. Athens Memorial mobilized every available staff member as ambulances brought in the injured. I worked 36 hours straight, moving from patient to patient, in a fog of exhaustion and determination, sustained only by coffee and the fierce need to save every child we could. Among the most severely injured was 10-year-old Sarah Collins, a small, dark-haired girl who had lost both parents in a car accident the year before and was being raised by an elderly grandmother. The bus crash had left her with a broken leg, internal injuries, and in the cruelest twist of fate, no surviving family when her grandmother suffered a fatal heart attack upon hearing news of the accident. Sarah's case affected me in ways I couldn't explain. During my breaks, I found myself drawn to her bedside reading stories, combing her tangled hair helping her with the coloring books visitors had brought to cheer the injured children. When she asked, her voice small and scared, "What's going to happen to me now?" I had no good answer. "The state will find a good home for her," the social worker assured me. "But with her injuries and her age, it might take some time. Foster care most likely until something permanent opens up." The thought of this fragile child already so damaged by life's cruelties entering the foster system struck me as unbearably wrong. Without fully considering the implications, I heard myself say, "What if I took her just temporarily, until she's fully recovered?" The process was neither simple nor quick. As a single woman in small-town Ohio in 1969, my fitness as even a temporary guardian was questioned extensively by social workers, judges, and well-meaning neighbors who couldn't understand why an unmarried woman would choose to take on such responsibility. Yet something about fighting for Sarah awakened a fierceness in me I hadn't known I possessed. This wasn't about healing my own wounds anymore. This was about protecting someone smaller and more vulnerable than myself. "You've never even had a child of your own," my mother protested when I told my parents of my plan. "And that apartment of yours is hardly suitable for a growing girl." "Then I'll move," I said with a certainty that brooked no argument. "And I'll learn. People have been raising children since the beginning of time without instruction manuals." By autumn, I had relocated to a small rental house near Millfield Elementary, and Sarah was officially in my temporary care. Her recovery was slow, the physical healing outpacing the emotional trauma of her losses. Nightmares woke her screaming most nights. Phantom pains in her mended leg kept her from fully participating in school activities. But gradually, cautiously, we built a routine that felt almost like family. "How long will I stay with you?" she asked one evening as I helped her with spelling homework at the kitchen table. As long as you need to," I answered carefully, not wanting to pressure her with my growing hope that temporary might become permanent. The legal process of adopting Sarah took nearly 2 years, a labyrinth of home studies, court appearances, and scrutiny of my fitness as a mother that sometimes felt more invasive than helpful. The social worker assigned to our case was initially skeptical. "You've experienced significant trauma yourself, Miss Watson," she noted during one of her visits, consulting her clipboard as if it held the secrets to my soul. "Are you certain you're emotionally equipped to raise a traumatized child?" "I think I'm equipped precisely because I understand trauma," I replied, "and because I know that life continues afterward." In May of 1971, the adoption was finalized. Sarah Collins became Sarah Watson, legally and forever my daughter, though she had claimed that place in my heart long before any judge made it official. The courtroom was filled with supporters, my aging parents, colleagues from the hospital, Mrs. Willis from the elementary school, even James, who had become like family to both of us. "Well done, Eleanor," James whispered as we celebrated afterward at a small gathering in my house. "You've created something beautiful from pain." Sarah's presence transformed my life in ways I could never have predicted. Through her, I formed connections with other parents, joined the PTA-hosted sleepovers that filled my quiet house with girlish laughter. The whispers about poor Eleanor left at the altar gradually faded, replaced by Sarah's mom, or Nurse Watson. The years passed with the rhythm of a child, growing school concerts and science projects, first crushes and teenage rebellions, quiet bedtime talks, and fierce arguments about curfews. I continued working at the hospital, eventually becoming head nurse of the maternity ward. My friendship with James deepened into something that occasionally verged on romance, though neither of us seemed willing to risk defining it further. By 1979, Sarah was 20, a sophomore at Ohio University, studying education with plans to become a teacher. My parents had both passed away, Mama in 1975, Daddy 2 years later, leaving me their house in Millfield, which I kept, but rented out, preferring to stay in the home where Sarah and I had built our life together. Life had settled into a pattern I found deeply satisfying, if not exactly thrilling. I was content with my work, proud of my daughter, secure in friendships that had been tested by time and found true. At 45, I thought I had faced the worst life could offer and emerged stronger for it. And then, on a rainy April afternoon, as I returned home from a shift at the hospital, I found him sitting on my porch steps like a ghost made flesh older grayer at the temples, wearing an expensive suit that spoke of success and distance, but unmistakably Richard Miller. 15 years after he had disappeared from the church altar, the man who had shaped the course of my life by abandoning it had returned to Millfield. And with him came a truth that would shake the very foundations of everything I thought I knew about love, betrayal, and the cruel mathematics of human choice. I stood frozen at the bottom of my driveway, rain soaking through my nurse's uniform, my umbrella hanging forgotten at my side. 15 years had changed him, silver threaded through hair that had once been coal black lines etched around eyes that had once seemed capable of seeing straight into my soul. But I would have recognized Richard Miller anywhere in any crowd, under any circumstances. "Hello, Eleanor," he said, rising slowly from my porch steps, as if his very bones ached with the weight of what he'd come to say. His voice was different now, deeper, carrying the polished accent of New York's elite that had completely erased his Ohio drawl. But underneath the sophistication, I heard something else, uncertainty, maybe even fear. 1,000 emotions crashed through me like competing storm fronts, shock, anger, curiosity, and underneath it all, a strange sense of calm that surprised me more than his sudden appearance. I had imagined this moment countless times in those early years, rehearsed cutting speeches that would bring him to his knees with remorse. But standing there with rain dripping from my hair into my eyes, I felt only a distant wonder at my own composure. "You're trespassing," I said flatly, walking past him to unlock my front door. I stepped inside, but didn't close the door, an invitation he didn't deserve, but that my ingrained politeness couldn't withhold. He followed me into the small living room, where Sarah's college textbooks lay scattered across the coffee table, alongside my nursing journals, where framed photographs chronicled a life he'd played no part in building. His eyes lingered on a recent Christmas picture of Sarah and me laughing beside our tree, both of us wearing the matching sweaters she'd insisted on buying despite my protests that we'd look ridiculous. "Your daughter?" he asked, gesturing toward the photos. Yes." I didn't elaborate. Whatever his reasons for appearing after 15 years of silence, he hadn't earned the right to Sarah's story. I went to the kitchen, methodically filling the coffee percolator and setting it on the stove. The familiar ritual steadied my hands, gave me something to focus on besides the ghost from my past standing awkwardly in my living room, looking as out of place as a peacock in a chicken coop. "You look well," he offered when I returned with 2 cups of coffee. I laughed, a short, humorless sound. "What are you doing here, Richard? Surely you didn't travel all this way to comment on my appearance." He accepted the coffee, but didn't drink, instead cradling the cup between his palms as if seeking its warmth. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. "My wife died," he said abruptly. "Cancer, 3 months ago." "I'm sorry for your loss." I replied automatically, the words I'd spoken to countless grieving families at the hospital over the years. And I was sorry that anyone should face that particular devastation, even him. "We had a good marriage," he continued, his voice carefully controlled. 15 years. She was kind, Eleanor, better than I deserved." I waited, sensing there was more. Richard had always had a flair for the dramatic, for building up to revelations, like a preacher working toward salvation. When she was diagnosed terminal from the start, she made me promise something. He looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. "She made me promise to come back here and make things right with you." "There's nothing to make right," I said coolly. "What's done is done. We've both built lives that took us in different directions." "That's not entirely true, Eleanor." His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "I haven't been honest with you about why I left." Part of me wanted to stop him there, to preserve the narrative I'd constructed over 15 years, that Richard had simply been a coward seduced by the bright lights of New York and the promise of wealth. That explanation had been painful but comprehensible, something I could package neatly and set aside. But another part, the nurse who had learned to face difficult truths, the mother who had taught Sarah the value of honesty, recognized that whatever Richard had come to say, I needed to hear it. "Go on," I said. Richard set down his untouched coffee and reached for a briefcase I hadn't noticed him carrying. From it, he withdrew a thick manila envelope softened at the edges, as if it had been handled often over the years. 2 days before our wedding, I received this. He slid the envelope across the coffee table toward me. It was delivered to my apartment by a man I'd never seen before. He said he worked for Jonathan Pearson. The name hit me like a physical blow. Jonathan Pearson had been Millfield's wealthiest and most powerful resident owner of the textile mill that employed half the town, including my father. A man with a reputation for ruthlessness in business and pleasure alike, who got what he wanted by whatever means necessary. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside were photographs, grainy black and white images that made my stomach lurch with revulsion. They showed a young woman with an older man in various compromising positions. The woman's face was clearly visible. My mother. There were 50 more like those, Richard said quietly as I stared in horror at the images. And documents, financial records showing your father had been embezzling from the mill for years. Receipts, bank statements, canceled checks with his signature. My head spun like I was falling through space with no ground in sight. My father, the most honest man I'd ever known, who returned extra change at the grocery store and wouldn't take so much as a pencil home from work. A thief. My mother, pious and proper, who considered dancing too risque for a Christian woman. Involved with Jonathan Pearson? It seemed not just impossible, but absurd. "This is a lie," I whispered, pushing the envelope away as if it were contaminated. "A cruel fabrication." Richard shook his head slowly. "I thought so too at first. I went to Pearson the next day, told him I would go to the police, expose his blackmail attempt. He laughed in my face, said he owned half the police department in the county." He paused, running a hand through his silver hair. Then he showed me more evidence. Bank deposits that matched the dates when money went missing from mill accounts. Hotel receipts. Even a letter in your mother's handwriting thanking Pearson for his generosity and promising to meet him again soon. Why? I managed, my voice barely audible. Why would Pearson do this? Richard's jaw tightened with old anger. Because I had refused to sell him my grandfather's land, the 100 acres outside town that bordered his property. He wanted to expand the mill, and I was the only obstacle. He made it crystal clear, give up you and the land, or watch your family be destroyed. Pieces began falling into place like dominoes. My father's sudden retirement from the mill just months after my failed wedding. The way my mother had withdrawn from church activities, from social gatherings, from life itself. Their abrupt decision to move to Arizona for her health in 1966, where they had lived quietly until their deaths. You could have told me, I said, anger finally breaking through the shock. We could have faced it together, fought back somehow. Pearson was explicit about that. Richard replied, his voice hollow. If I warned you or your parents, if I tried to involve anyone else, he would release everything immediately. I had less than 48 hours to decide. He leaned forward, his eyes pleading for understanding. I wasn't sure I could give. I thought I convinced myself that I was protecting you. That a clean break, even a cruel one, was better than watching your family name dragged through the mud. Your father imprisoned. Your mother's indiscretions made public for the whole town to dissect. So you ran, I said, with Tommy. Tommy was never supposed to be part of it, Richard admitted. He caught me packing that night, demanded answers. When I told him everything, he insisted on coming with me, said he couldn't face you knowing the truth and keeping silent about it. And the letter, I asked. That self-serving garbage about not being trapped in a small town. Richard's laugh was bitter as unsweetened medicine. Pearson's idea. He dictated every word, said it would help you hate me, make the break cleaner. He was right about that at least. Silence settled between us, heavy with 15 years of consequences from decisions made in desperate haste. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving only the rhythmic dripping from the eaves and the sound of my own heart beating too fast in my chest. "Why now?" I finally asked. "After all this time, why come back with this?" "Because Pearson is dead," Richard said simply. "He died 6 weeks ago. Heart attack in his office, surrounded by all the wealth and power he'd accumulated over the years." He paused, then reached into his briefcase again. "And because on her deathbed, my wife made me promise to tell you the truth. She said," his voice faltered, "she said no one should live their whole life believing they weren't enough when the truth was something else entirely." I stood abruptly, needing movement, needing distance from revelations that threatened to topple everything I thought I understood about my own life. What did this mean for the strength I'd found in abandonment? For the woman I'd become in response to betrayal? "Eleanor, there's more," Richard said, and I turned back to him, wondering what possible revelation could follow what he'd already shared. From his briefcase, he withdrew another envelope, newer than the first. "After Pearson died, I went to his office building, convinced his secretary to let me search through his files. I found this. Inside were technical documents, analysis reports, testimonials from photography experts and handwriting analysts. The professional language was dense, but the conclusions were clear and damning. The photographs of your mother were staged." Richard said, his face ashen. "Professional models made to look like her through retouching techniques. The financial documents were forgeries, expert ones that would have fooled most people, but forgeries nonetheless." The room seemed to tilt around me. "What are you saying?" "Your parents were innocent, Eleanor. Of everything. Pearson fabricated it all to manipulate me into giving up the land and abandoning you." I sank back into my chair, the magnitude of it crashing over me like a tsunami. All those years of pain of rebuilding myself from shattered pieces, all because of one powerful man's greed and one young man's fear. "Get out," I whispered, my voice deadly quiet. "Eleanor, please, get out!" I screamed, the force of it tearing at my throat like broken glass. 15 years, Richard. 15 years I spent believing I wasn't enough, that something was fundamentally wrong with me, that the man I loved found me so lacking, he couldn't even face me to say goodbye. He stood gathering his briefcase with shaking hands, looking older than his 45 years. "I'll leave everything, all the documents, all the proof. You deserve to have it." At the door, he paused without turning around. "I'm staying at the Millfield Inn for the week. If you want to talk more after you've had time to process this." When the door closed behind him, I collapsed onto the sofa, my mind reeling like a broken compass that couldn't find true north. The foundation of my adult life, the abandonment that had shaped me, the strength I'd found in its aftermath, suddenly felt built on quicksand. If Richard had been protecting me rather than rejecting me, what did that mean for the woman I'd become? If my parents had been innocent victims rather than flawed humans who'd made terrible choices, how did that change the story I'd told myself about forgiveness and understanding? I don't know how long I sat there, lost in the labyrinth of implications, before the front door opened and Sarah's voice called out, bright with concern. "Mom." "Why is there a strange man sitting in his car outside our house? He looks like he's been crying." Sarah, my anchor, my redemption. Whatever truths Richard had brought with him, they couldn't change the most important reality of my life, the daughter who had healed me in ways I hadn't known I needed healing. "It's a long story, sweetheart," I said, wiping my eyes and attempting a smile. "A very, very long story." That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with both envelopes spread before me. The fabricated evidence that had destroyed my wedding day. The proof that those fabrications were lies. 15 years of my life redirected by malice and deception. I thought of the path I hadn't taken: marriage to Richard, perhaps children of our own, a quiet life in the small house we'd planned to buy near the park. Would I have become a nurse? Would Sarah have found her way into my arms? Would I have discovered the fierce independence that had sustained me through so many challenges? The telephone rang, startling me from my reverie. It was nearly midnight, too late for casual calls. "Eleanor!" James's voice was thick with concern. "I just got off shift and heard through the hospital grapevine that Richard Miller is back in town. Are you all right?" The genuine worry in his tone brought fresh tears to my eyes. This was my life now, a career I loved, a daughter who was thriving, friends who truly cared about my well-being. Would I have had any of it if Richard hadn't left? "He came to see me," I admitted. "It's complicated, James. He had his reasons for leaving, ones I never imagined. Do you need company? I can be there in 20 minutes. I considered the offer. James had been my steadiest friend for over a decade, always there when I needed support, never pushing for more than I could give. "No, but thank you. I need time to think, to process all of this." After hanging up, I returned to the envelopes. With deliberate movements, I gathered the photographs, the forged documents, the proof of their falsehood, and carried them all to the fireplace. One by one, I fed them to the flames, watching as the lies that had shaped 15 years of my life curled and blackened, and finally disintegrated into ash. The truth, I realized, was both simpler and more complex than the story I'd told myself. Richard hadn't rejected me, he'd been manipulated into believing he was protecting me. My parents hadn't been the flawed people Pearson had painted them as, but they also hadn't been the saints I'd imagined in their defense. And I had built a meaningful life on the foundation of an abandonment that was both real in its impact and false in its motivation. As the last document turned to cinders, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would go to the Millfield Inn. Not to forgive Richard. I wasn't sure forgiveness was possible for 15 years of absence, regardless of his reasons. But to understand, to hear the complete story, to learn what had become of the boy I had once loved enough to marry. And perhaps in that understanding, I might find a way to reconcile the woman I had become with the woman I might have been, and discover they weren't as different as I had always believed. The Millfield Inn hadn't changed much since its construction in the 1920s. The same faded burgundy carpet in the lobby, the same oak registration desk polished to a high shine, the same slightly musty smell that spoke of decades of travelers passing through our small town like ships in the night. The elderly desk clerk, Mr. Chambers, recognized me immediately. "Nurse Watson, is everything all right?" His concern was genuine. In a town this size, the head maternity nurse typically only visited the inn when a guest had taken seriously ill. "Everything's fine, Mr. Chambers. I'm here to see Richard Miller. Could you ring his room, please?" His eyebrows shot up nearly to his hairline, but to his credit, he said nothing as he dialed. Small towns have long memories, and my abandoned wedding was still the stuff of local legend nearly 2 decades later. 5 minutes later, I sat across from Richard in the inn's nearly deserted tea room, a pot of Earl Grey between us, growing cold as we studied each other like archaeologists examining artifacts from a lost civilization. He looked as if he hadn't slept, dark circles beneath eyes that had once seemed capable of holding all the stars in the sky. His usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled in a way that made him seem more human, more vulnerable than the polished stranger who had appeared on my porch. "I didn't expect to hear from you so soon," he admitted. "Or at all honestly." I wrapped my hands around my teacup, drawing strength from its warmth. "I burned the envelopes last night, all of it." Alarm flashed across his face. "But the proof—" "I don't need proof, Richard," I interrupted. "I've lived with one version of the truth for 15 years. I'm not interested in preserving another version on paper." I met his gaze steadily. "What I want is to understand everything, from the very beginning." For the next 3 hours, as the spring sun climbed higher and the tea room slowly filled with the lunch crowd, Richard told me the complete story. The terror he'd felt when Pearson's messenger delivered that envelope. His desperate attempts to verify the contents. The veiled threats against not just my family, but against me personally. He had connections everywhere, Eleanor. Richard said, his voice hollow with remembered fear. Powerful people in New York and Columbus, even in Washington. He said if I didn't do exactly as he demanded, you'd never work in any hospital in the country. That he could make sure no nursing school would accept you, that your career would be over before it began. So you sacrificed us to save me, I said. Not a question, but a statement that hung in the air between us like incense. I did what I thought was right at the time, he replied, passing a hand over his face. I was 23, Eleanor. Terrified. I had less than 2 days to decide the fate of everyone I cared about. He paused, his voice becoming even quieter. I convinced myself it was noble, sparing you the scandal, protecting your future. But I've had 15 years to realize it was also cowardice. I should have found another way. Should have been brave enough to fight. I thought of the frightened young man. He had been barely more than a boy, really facing down one of the most powerful men in the county. It would have taken exceptional courage to defy Pearson, the kind of courage few people possess at any age. What happened after New York? I asked. He told me about law school funded by his new wife's family money, about his career at her uncle's prestigious firm, about the drinking problem that developed in his 30s as the weight of his choices pressed down on him, about the nightmares that had never fully subsided, about the therapy that had helped him understand the trauma of his own coerced decision. Judith, my wife, she knew something was broken in me, he said, his voice softening for the first time. I told her about you, about Millfield, about everything that happened. This was about 5 years into our marriage, during one of the bad periods when I was drinking too much and sleeping too little. She sounds remarkable, I said, and meant it. She was extraordinary, Eleanor. She could have left, found someone whole. Instead, she pushed me to heal, to face what I'd done, and find a way to live with it. As he spoke, I studied the man before me, so different from the boy I had loved. Richard had achieved everything he might have wanted in material terms. Success, wealth, status, all of it evident in his tailored clothes and expensive watch. Yet there was a hollowness about him, a sadness that all his achievements hadn't been able to fill. Tell me about your daughter, he said suddenly, as if reading my thoughts. In the pictures, she looks happy. You both do. For the first time since sitting down, I smiled genuinely. Sarah is my miracle. She came to me when we both needed saving. I told him about the bus accident, about Sarah's injuries, both physical and emotional, about our gradual bonding as I helped her heal, and she, unknowingly, helped heal me. Adopting her was the best decision I ever made. You became a mother, he said with wonder, as if the concept was almost too beautiful to believe. I always knew you would be a wonderful mother. The simple observation, spoken with such certainty, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. In our youthful plans, we had talked of having 4 children, had even chosen names for the first boy and girl. And you, I asked, blinking away the moisture. You and Judith never had children. A shadow crossed his face. We couldn't. Complications from surgery she'd had as a teenager. We discussed adoption several times, but he twisted his wedding ring absently. The time never seemed right. My career was demanding, her health began to decline, and then it was too late. I recognized the particular grief in his voice, having heard it from many patients over the years, the sorrow of roads not taken, chances missed that can haunt a life, even when that life has been successful by external measures. What do you want from me, Richard? I asked, finally, the question that had been hovering between us since his reappearance. He looked genuinely startled. I don't want anything from you, Eleanor. I came to give you the truth, not to take something more. But you stayed. A week, you said. Why?" He hesitated, choosing his words with the care of a man who had learned that words have consequences. "I suppose I hoped there might be a way forward, not to reclaim what we lost, that's impossible, but perhaps to find some kind of peace with it, for both of us." As I walked home from the inn, the warm May afternoon wrapping around me like a gentle embrace, I turned our conversation over in my mind like worry beads. Richard had come seeking absolution, that much was clear. But could I give it? Should I? The question haunted me through dinner with Sarah, through my evening routine, through the sleepless hours that followed. The next morning, I called the hospital and for the first time in my career requested a personal day without being ill. Then I did something I had avoided for 15 years. I drove to the First Baptist Church where Richard and I were supposed to have been married. Reverend Wilson had long since retired, replaced by a younger man I knew only slightly. The church was empty at that morning hour, the light filtering through the stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across the worn wooden pews where I had learned about faith, forgiveness, and the mysteries of divine love. I sat in the back row, trying to reconcile the crushing pain of that long-ago June day with the complex truth I now possessed. The young minister found me there an hour later. "Nurse Watson, is everything all right?" "I'm not sure, Reverend," I replied with complete honesty. "I'm wrestling with forgiveness, the complicated kind." He sat beside me, this man young enough to be my son, and listened as I shared the broad strokes of Richard's return and revelations. "Forgiveness isn't for the other person," he said when I finished. "It's a gift you give yourself, a way of putting down a burden you never should have had to carry in the first place." His words stayed with me as I left the church and drove not home, but back to the Millfield Inn. Richard was surprised to see me again so soon. "I need to show you something," I said without preamble. "Will you come with me?" An hour later, we stood together in the Millfield Community Center, which housed a small museum of local history, along with meeting rooms for various civic organizations. The hallway was lined with photographs and newspaper clippings chronicling the town's development over the decades. "What are we doing here?" Richard asked, bewildered. "Looking at what grew from our broken wedding," I replied, stopping before a large framed photograph from 1972. It showed me younger and more serious, cutting a ribbon in front of what was clearly a medical facility. "This is the Millfield Free Clinic. I helped establish it 8 years ago with a grant I wrote. We provide health care to families who can't afford the hospital." I moved to another photo, Sarah at 16, surrounded by younger children, all of them smiling despite obvious troubles. "This is the Millfield Youth Support Group. Sarah started it after her own experiences with loss and trauma. It's helped dozens of children in the county work through difficult situations." One by one, I showed him the visible markers of the life I had built in his absence. Not just my career and motherhood, but community service programs, healthcare initiatives, youth outreach efforts, all growing from seeds planted in the soil of my own pain. "You see," I said, finally turning to face him, "what happened between us didn't just shape who I became. It rippled outward, touching other lives. I needed you to see that before we could talk about forgiveness." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "You're saying good came from what happened, from what I did." "I'm saying life is more complex than villains and victims, Richard. What Pearson did was unquestionably evil. What you did was human, flawed, misguided, but understandable given the circumstances." I took a deep breath, feeling something loosen in my chest. "And what I did afterward, the woman I became, the choices I made, the people I helped, those belong to me. Not to you, not to Pearson. To me." We walked in silence to the small park across from the community center, sitting on a bench beneath a flowering dogwood tree. A group of children played nearby, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze like music. "I think I've spent 15 years waiting for absolution," Richard said finally. "From you, from myself, even from Judith, though she never blamed me. He turned to face me, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of the boy I had once loved. But seeing all this, what you've built, who you've become, I realized something important. You didn't need me to come back and explain. You healed without me. Not completely, I admitted. There was always a part of me that wondered what was so wrong with me that the man I loved couldn't face me to say goodbye. But I built a good life despite that wondering. And now, I considered the question carefully. Now I understand that your leaving wasn't about my worth. It was about your fear, Pearson's manipulation, and the impossible situation you were placed in. I paused. That knowledge doesn't erase 15 years of pain, but it does change how I understand that pain. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the children play. Both of us lost in thoughts of what might have been and what actually was. "There's something else," Richard said eventually. "Something I haven't told you yet." I looked at him, wondering what secrets he still carried. "Pearson's dead, but his estate is still settling. The lawyers found documents showing he used similar tactics against other people over the years, blackmail, forged evidence, threats. There might be grounds for a lawsuit compensation for the damages he caused. I don't want his money," I said immediately. "Not for you," Richard replied. "For your clinic, for Sarah's youth programs, for the good work that grew from the bad he did to us." The idea had merit, I had to admit. The free clinic always struggled with funding, and Sarah's program operated on volunteer energy and donated supplies. Pearson's wealth gained through decades of manipulation and cruelty could be transformed into something healing. "I'll think about it," I said. As we prepared to part ways, Richard reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box I recognized immediately, the one that had held my engagement ring all those years ago. "You sent this back," he said. "After the wedding. I've carried it with me ever since, I'm not sure why." Inside, the small diamond still caught the light like captured starfire, just as it had when he'd proposed in Millfield Park, under a canopy of summer stars. "I want you to have it," he said. "Not as an engagement ring, I understand that time has passed, but as a symbol that what we had was real, even if it couldn't last." I took the box, feeling the weight of memory and possibility in my palm. "What will you do now, after this week?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Judith and I had no children, no close family. I have the law practice, but it feels empty now. Meaningless." He paused. "Maybe it's time to come home. To Ohio, I mean. Not to recreate the past, but to find a way to be useful in the present." The suggestion hung in the air between us, full of complicated possibilities. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with Sarah, the velvet box between us, as I told her the complete story about Richard, about Pearson's manipulation, about the choices that had shaped both our lives. "So he didn't abandon you because he didn't love you," she said when I finished. "He left because he did love you." "It's more complex than that," I replied. "Love should make you brave, not fearful. But he was very young, and the situation was impossible." Sarah, wise beyond her 20 years, studied the ring thoughtfully. "Are you going to see him again?" "I don't know, sweetheart. We're different people now. Too much has happened. Too much time has passed." "But you forgive him?" I considered her question carefully. "I'm learning to forgive him. Forgiveness isn't a moment, Sarah. It's a process, sometimes a lifelong one." The next morning, I woke to find Richard's car gone from the inn parking lot. A brief inquiry at the front desk revealed he had checked out before dawn, leaving only a forwarding address in New York, and a message for me. "Thank you for showing me what courage looks like." For weeks afterward, I found myself thinking about our conversations, about the roads not taken, and the paths that had led us both to who we became. The clinic received an unexpected donation, a substantial check from Richard's law firm, with a note saying it came from a friend of Eleanor Watson who believes in second chances. Summer arrived with its familiar rhythms, and life resumed its normal pace. Sarah graduated from college and accepted a teaching position at Millfield Elementary, the same school where I had worked all those years ago, when I was learning how to be someone other than a jilted bride. James and I continued our comfortable friendship, which had deepened over the years into something that might have become more if either of us had been brave enough to risk it. Then on a golden September afternoon, as I tended the small garden behind my house, I heard footsteps on the gravel path. I looked up to see Richard approaching, but this was a different man than the one who had appeared on my porch in April. Gone was the expensive suit and polished demeanor. Instead, he wore simple clothes and carried himself with the kind of ease that comes from making peace with difficult truths. "I came back," he said simply. "I can see that," I replied, brushing dirt from my hands. "Are you visiting, or—" "I bought the old Peterson place," he said, referring to a small house on the outskirts of town that had been empty since the doctor retired to Florida. "I'm starting a legal aid practice, helping people who can't afford lawyers fighting the kind of powerful men who think money gives them the right to manipulate other people's lives." I studied his face, looking for signs of the broken man I had spoken with at the inn. Instead, I saw something I hadn't expected: purpose. "That sounds meaningful," I said. "I hoped you might think so," he replied. "Eleanor, I know we can't go back. Too much has happened. Too much time has passed. But I wondered, might there be a way forward? Not as we were, but as we are now." I set down my gardening tools and really looked at him, this man who had shaped my life by leaving it, who had returned with truths that changed everything I thought I knew about love and betrayal. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I'm willing to find out." And so began the most unexpected chapter of my story, not a return to first love, but the slow, careful building of something entirely new. Richard established his practice and threw himself into cases involving domestic violence, elder abuse, and the kind of institutional corruption that Jonathan Pearson had embodied. I continued my work at the hospital while expanding the free clinic's services. We saw each other regularly, but carefully learning who we had become in the years apart. He attended Sarah's wedding when she married a young teacher named Michael the following spring. I was there when he won his first major case against a company that had been dumping chemicals in a poor neighborhood's water supply. Gradually, tentatively, trust began to rebuild, not the blind faith of youth, but the more solid foundation that comes from truly seeing and accepting another person's flaws alongside their strengths. "Do you think we would have been happy?" he asked one evening as we sat on my front porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. "If we had married that day in 1964, I think we would have been content," I replied after careful consideration. "But happiness, real happiness, comes from growth, from overcoming challenges, from becoming who you're meant to be. We both needed to become ourselves before we could truly appreciate each other." 3 years after his return, Richard asked me to marry him again. Not in the church where we had planned our first wedding, but in my garden surrounded by the roses I had planted and tended through all the seasons of my life. Sarah performed the ceremony she had become ordained online specifically for the occasion, a gesture that made us both laugh and cry simultaneously. We were both in our 50s by then, gray-haired and lined with experience, carrying the wisdom that comes only from surviving heartbreak and choosing to love again anyway. It wasn't the fairy tale wedding of my girlhood dreams, but it was something better, the deliberate choice of two people who had learned what love actually costs and decided it was worth paying. The years that followed brought their own challenges and joys. Richard's legal practice grew, taking on increasingly important cases that brought positive changes to our community and beyond. I eventually retired from the hospital but continued volunteering at the free clinic and working with Sarah's expanded youth programs. We traveled together, seeing places I had only dreamed of visiting during my years as a single mother. We weathered illnesses and losses, celebrated grandchildren, Sarah's children, who called us both Grandma and Grandpa without distinction. We learned the particular intimacy that comes from choosing someone not just once, but repeatedly, day after day, year after year. And through it all, I carried the knowledge that our love story was not the simple narrative of first romance I had once imagined it would be. Instead, it was something far more complex and ultimately more beautiful, a story of betrayal and forgiveness, of loss and redemption, of two people who learned that sometimes the most profound love grows not from never being hurt, but from choosing to trust again, despite the wounds. Now, as I near the end of my story, I want you to understand something important. I am not telling you this to convince you that every broken heart can be mended or that every lost love should be reclaimed. Life is not a romance novel where all threads tie neatly together in the final chapter. Rather, I am telling you this to share what I have learned over 8 decades of living, that the most beautiful gardens often grow from the most barren soil, that the strongest hearts are forged in fires that would consume lesser spirits, and that sometimes the life you never planned becomes the life you were always meant to live. Richard and I were blessed with a second chance, but that blessing came only after we had both done the hard work of becoming people worthy of it. I might never have become a nurse if he hadn't left. I would never have adopted Sarah, never have established the clinic, never have discovered the fierce independence that sustained me through so many challenges. And Richard might never have found the courage to fight powerful men on behalf of the powerless if he hadn't first experienced what it felt like to be manipulated by someone with more power than conscience. Our pain became our purpose. Our wounds became our wisdom, and our broken places became the spaces where light could enter and transform us into who we were meant to be. That perhaps is the truest lesson of any life. It is not the absence of suffering that defines a good life, but what you choose to build with that suffering. Not the wrongs done to you, but how you transform them into something that serves not just yourself, but the larger community of human hearts trying to find their way home to love. As I write these final words, sitting in the same kitchen where I burned Richard's first letter all those years ago, I can see him in the garden, gray-haired and gentle, tending the roses we planted together. Sarah lives nearby with her family, and her children play in the yard where she once helped me heal from my own childhood wounds. The free clinic has expanded into a full community health center. The youth program now serves 3 counties. Richard's legal aid practice has inspired similar efforts across the state. Good has grown from pain, love has emerged from loss, and the small town of Millfield, Ohio, has become a place where broken hearts come to discover they can still be useful to the world. I have lived long enough to know that there are no perfect endings, only perfect moments scattered through imperfect lives, like stars across a dark sky. But I have also lived long enough to know that those moments are worth everything, worth the tears, worth the waiting, worth the willingness to believe that morning always follows the longest night. If you are reading this and nursing your own broken heart, if you are sitting in your own wreckage wondering how to go on, let me tell you what I have learned. You are stronger than you know. Your pain has purpose, and the love that is meant for you, whether it comes as romantic love, familial love, friendship, or the deep satisfaction of meaningful work, will find you when you are ready to receive it. Trust the process. Trust the growth. And most of all, trust yourself to build something beautiful from whatever pieces you've been given. That, dear friends, is how an 82-year-old woman learned that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with "once upon a time," but with "I thought my story was over," and discovered instead that it was just beginning.